Oh, Martina, yes. Chile has implemented a very significant environmental tax reform in 2014. It was incorporated into a broader major tax reform, and it introduced three taxes. A tax on the first sale of cars, which was interesting because it was based on a formula of NOx emissions over a lifetime. A second tax and a third tax, both on stationary sources, essentially boilers and turbines. And the first tax was on local contaminants, particulate matter, NOx, and SO2, also based on a formula that tried to capture the environmental damage of those emissions. And the final tax on these stationary sources was a $5 tax on carbon emissions. Now, what was important about this tax is that unlike other taxes across the world, it is a tax on emissions, not on carbon content of fuels. Therefore, it was very important to establish an MRV system, monitoring, reporting, and verification system, in order to measure accurately emissions. And therefore, it's important in terms of the development of an institutional infrastructure for the measurement of carbon emissions. Well, these reforms are generally quite difficult to implement. I would say that there are three main problems or bottlenecks or conflicts in the implementation. Usually we refer to the political problems as a first implementation issue. In the case of Chile, passing the law wasn't a major political conflict because the environmental reform was put into a broader tax reform. So it wasn't discussed in much detail across the parliament. However, there are two other types of conflict which are important and make implementation difficult. The first one is once the tax is approved, there is significant conflict across the government sector. What you find is that the environmental ministry, the Ministry of Finance, and other more economic ministries tend to have a lot of conflict in the implementation stage, and this is what happened in the case of Chile. Now, this is important, I think, because for the first time we have a Ministry of Finance and a Ministry of Economy and an Internal Revenue Service that is interested in environmental issues. A second conflict, of course, is with the companies as you try and implement this technically. And in the case of carbon taxes based on emissions, there is a lot of conflict associated with monetary reporting schemes, and therefore a lot of capacity building that has to be put in place both at the government level and also within firms. Fortunately, in the case of Chile, there was also a partial reporting scheme in place through a PRTR scheme. This is a pollutant and release inventory system which exists in many countries. So therefore, we piggybacked on that system in order to have a reporting scheme. But I think it's essential to develop MRV systems. This will be important for a whole range of environmental concerns, and therefore I think taxation is not only important in terms of those taxes, but also in terms of other environmental policies. I think this is something that we'll have to evaluate in due course. For the moment, the tax have been important in terms of how much they cover emissions. Carbon emissions covered by the tax, the carbon tax, are around 40 to 45% of total emissions. So it is an important and significant coverage, and it essentially covers the whole energy sector. Secondly, I think it's been important in terms of revenues. The three taxes cover around $300 million, and the two taxes on carbon and particulate matter in stationary sources, it's around $200 million. Unfortunately, Chile does not have earmarking constitutionally, but in the case of the carbon tax, we are considering now with a new tax reform in government, an offsetting scheme of the taxation. So companies could eventually offset the tax by ensuring reductions of carbon emissions in other sectors or in other companies. This system has yet to be developed, but it's being discussed in Congress to be approved legally, and therefore we would have to set up an MRV system now considering some form of baseline in order to ensure an appropriate mechanism in order to allow for this offsetting scheme. Of course, the principal purpose of a scheme like that would be to ensure environmental security or environmental commitment. So therefore there must be verification and assurance that emissions have actually been reduced. One issue which I think is important to point out is that many times we believe that not very high taxes have an impact. In the case of Chile, we estimated that the appropriate price of the carbon tax would be around $40 to $50 in order to generate an impact in terms of the incentive structure of reducing carbon emissions. However, what we've observed is that even these very small taxes act as a signaling device, and many companies internalize expectations of higher taxes in the future. So we are observing many changes in terms of carbon emission reductions in energy companies. In fact, most companies have, energy companies have already said that they will be carbon neutral by 2040, and many have said that they will dismantle their carbon plants. In fact, there has been a voluntary agreement between the government and energy plants to eliminate all coal plants. There are about 24 coal plants in the country by 2030. Chile's experience in the region, I think, is important essentially because of the choice of the tax design, which is based on, as I was saying, carbon emissions rather than the carbon content of fuels. Now, what that means in practice is that Chile has had to design an institutional infrastructure that identifies technologies for measurement and systems to estimate emissions rather than carbon content. And associated with that is reporting and verification. Also, another thing which I think is important, it gives a different relevance to environmental ministries, because it's the environmental ministries that have to verify these emissions. And therefore, it establishes a dialogue between environmental authorities and finance authorities. And I think this is important in the future. And finally, as I think is important, is that it's very difficult to conceive of market-based instruments with global markets through carbon content-based taxes. We do require some form of carbon emissions taxation, because that's the way to establish these instruments, both in terms of eventually carbon emission exchange schemes or other policies in terms of financing natural-based solutions. Developing tax systems on the basis of emissions instead of carbon content of fuel, I think it's very important, because it's the first step to develop more significant market-based instruments in climate change mitigation. I think this is important for essentially two reasons. The first reason is that the global cost of mitigation are extremely high. One NGO places it at around $4 trillion, another in the billions. So therefore, we have to find mechanisms in order to reduce the costs of carbon emissions. Now, since reducing a ton of emission anywhere in the world has the same impact, but the cost of reducing that ton of emission varies considerably, then we have the idea of global markets in place. Now, typically we've been thinking of global markets only in terms of ETS, that is emissions trading schemes. But We can broaden the idea of markets simply as transfers of money across nation states or countries in terms of ensuring reductions. And this is what the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement allows for. So, for example, in the case of Sweden, it has a tax of over $100 a ton for carbon emissions. And in the case of Chile, we have a tax for $5 a tax on carbon emissions. In order to ensure reductions, perhaps Sweden can pay more than $6, say $10 or $20 or $30 for the carbon emission in Chile. That will allow a considerable reduction in the cost of carbon emissions across countries. And we don't require complex ETS schemes, but rather carbon emission reduction bilateral agreements, as is established in the negotiation of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. The second reason I think this is important is because we have to be thinking of carbon in terms of the carbon cycle. And it's not only carbon emissions that are a problem, but also carbon sinks and other features of natural-based carbon cycle solutions. So therefore, we could be thinking of the carbon cycle, and therefore countries like, once again, Sweden, instead of paying Chile money for emissions reductions, it could pay Chile or other countries money for natural-based solutions in order to ensure the protection of important biosphere ecosystems, but also that act as carbon sinks. So by having this type of tax, we have the basis of a carbon cycle policy.